about 17% of Americans think the sun revolves around the earth rather than the earth revolving around the sun, and about 25% of Americans think climate change is not an issue, not happening. So we've actually made a lot of progress. You know, Galileo figured out the first thing 300 years ago. So we've come a long way with climate understanding in the last decade or two. So we have these two phenomena, and they interact in really intriguing and wonderfully fascinating ways. Peak oil is one of them, climate change is another. And in my own life, you may have the same experience in yours. I know people that believe in one of the phenomena and do not believe in the other. I know people that believe in both of them, and I know people that believe in neither. I know really good petroleum geologists, for example, that are concerned about climate change, but debunk the whole idea that peak oil is of any concern. It's really interesting to see where people are on these issues. What I want to do this evening is before introducing the first speaker, is just to show you an animation. I think what gets lost in the climate discussion so often is the element of time. So this is an animation. We'll start in 1900, and what you see there on the top is you see a map of the world. You can pick out North America, and you're seeing annual averages shown on that bar there and also in colors on the map. And the degrees on the bar, degrees Celsius, so you can essentially double them to get degrees Fahrenheit. So let's go ahead and start, 1920. Anything that's cool is a year that was cooler than normal in that part of the world. So World War II is starting now. And about 1950 is when this enormous explosion of fossil fuel consumption begins, if you saw David Hughes's presentation. Volcanoes cool the world. And about 1980 is when this warming, this dramatic warming started that we've lived through in the last 25 years. So let's stop there just for a minute. So this is what we've lived through. This is the heat wave, in effect, that we've lived through, where most of the warmest years in the last 140 years have occurred since 1985. And Pushkar would know this better, but I think the 10 warmest years have occurred since about 1992. The Arctic is warming very rapidly. The northern latitudes are warming more rapidly than the equator. Now, here's where things get really interesting from a climate science point of view. And this is the two discussions that we're going to hear tonight address this. You've heard Al Gore talk about climate change as a planetary emergency. You've heard other people talk about us needing reductions of 70% or 80% or 90% from the forecast baseline. But the baseline for the coming century is very uncertain. There's a big fat book that I carry around. It's about this thick. It has 40 different scenarios in it. These are emission scenarios. Think of them as carbon pathways through the coming century. So future warming is a function of how much carbon we put into the air, how much fossil fuel we burn, what sort of technologies we use to burn it with. So what I'm going to show you now is one of a multitude of possible future scenarios. And this is a mid-range scenario. This is a scenario where carbon emissions grow to mid-century and then begin going down. So some of the scenarios that the climate modelers work with put a lot more carbon into the air, and some of the scenarios they work with put somewhat less carbon in the air. So let's go ahead and look at what a mid-range scenario looks like. Now, emissions are going down, but temperatures are still going up, and Pushkar and Dave will explain why that is. By about this point, it's unlikely we have any summer sea ice in the Arctic, if not 30 or 40 years sooner than that.
Which scenario is this? Do you know the name of it?
What's that?
You know which scenario this is? What the name is? This is A2. Yeah, that's actually a little more extreme. Yeah.
So by the end of the coming century, in this scenario in which we've injected about, I think it's 1,400 or 1,500 gigatons, billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere, the world is different. You may have read some of Jim Hansen's papers. He's a prominent scientist, climate scientist. He talks about creating a different world if we don't begin addressing the climate problem. Now, the point Matt was making, I thought, was quite intriguing because it's begun to I've begun thinking in similar veins myself. The climate modelers, what I find most fascinating about the work they've done is they have not put any real fossil fuel constraints into the models. So they've been running these models, spending tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, and there are really no significant fossil fuel constraints in the models. Now, this is actually a wonderful piece of good news if you're concerned about climate change, because it means this problem might be somewhat more tractable, more resolvable than we sometimes are led to believe. So that's what the two discussions we're going to hear tonight are. What if we put somewhat less carbon into the atmosphere due to peak oil or other fossil fuel constraints and governmental policies that restricted the use of unconventional fuels?